Hi, everybody. This is Tom Quinn, zooming in from Seattle, Washington. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in your lovely city and country, but I'm here to talk a little bit about the life cycle and biology of pink salmon as it might relate to your experiences over in Europe. The outline of the talk will be to briefly review the basic biology and population dynamics of pink salmon, and then review some traits pertaining to their ability or tendency to colonize, as I gather they're doing quite rapidly over in your part of the world. Pink salmon, Oncorhynchus gorbutia, are conspicuous in a number of traits. The juveniles emerge from the gravel, essentially already smolt, ready to go to sea. You can see the juvenile here has no par marks, unlike the chum salmon, also shown in this photograph. They're already seawater tolerant. In fact, they can go straight from freshwater into seawater. At sea, they grow rapidly, and they're known for their small scales and sort of soft spots on the upper and lower lobes of the tail and across their back. This is a male having just left the ocean and entered freshwater. At maturity, the females and males both have white bellies, kind of a grayish, greenish, pinkish sides. And you can see here the fairly large, sort of soft, conspicuous spots. This is a female pink salmon. And the male has a very, very conspicuous dorsal hump, hence the alternative common name humpy or humpback salmon. And of course, unlike your Atlantic salmon, these and the rest of the Pacific salmon have kind of an overbite rather than the underbite. They're really not ever to be mistaken for any other species of salmon when they're on the spawning grounds. And again, you see the white belly here. They do get large. This is a picture of a rather grotesque male. It was a Washington State record, 15 something pounds, much more conspicuously, typical are the ones that I caught here, maybe a kilo or so. These fish were caught fly fishing from a beach here in Puget Sound. So there are several important aspects of the pink salmon life history that's important to bear in mind, and they differ dramatically from other Pacific salmon, and especially from Atlantic salmon and brown trout. The first, as I mentioned, is that the fry migrate directly to sea rather than feeding in streams. So they may be very, very numerous in streams as spawners, and the fry may be very numerous, but their impact on the freshwater ecosystem is comparatively slight because they migrate straight to sea. Commonly, they are in the lower reaches of rivers and so can be spawning very close to salt water or even in salt water, brackish water, although there are exceptions to this as with just about everything else. When they go to sea, they tend to occupy the offshore waters. There's a short migration along the coast, but primarily they're feeding in the open ocean, relatively close to the surface, the top few tens of meters. They grow very, very rapidly. They might increase their mass 10,000 fold from perhaps 0.2 grams to 2 kilos in about a year and a half. Their diet is quite broad. They eat crustaceans, larval crabs, shrimp, krill, copepods, and so forth, but also squid and small fishes. The return migration in our part of the world, in Puget Sound, Washington, is typically in August, and spawning is in August and September. But of course, farther north in Alaska, that will occur earlier. So there's a generally recognized trend of migration and timing with latitude. Generally spawn in the lower reaches of rivers, and again, even in the intertidal zone in some areas of Southeast Alaska. However, in other parts of the range, their habitat use patterns are quite different. So it's dangerous to generalize about pink salmon because despite their simple life cycle, there's also quite a lot of kind of hidden variation. And overall, as Pacific salmon go, they're by a far margin the most numerous in both numbers and in biomass. So whatever peculiarities they have in their life cycle, it's clearly being very, very successful because they are so very numerous. Again, some of the aspects of their population dynamics that are really important to bear in mind. The first is that the juveniles don't rear in fresh water. So you can pack a lot of spawning adults into the streams because you don't have to feed their juveniles. Unlike Atlantic salmon, brown trout, and several of the other Pacific salmon species and trout, where the juveniles have to feed in the stream, the carrying capacity for pinks is set by the spawning gravel, whereas the other species is typically set by the rearing capacity of the stream, insects, holding habitat, and so forth. Pink salmon have become increasingly abundant in recent decades here in their native range. This is in part because of hatchery propagation, but the wild populations are also doing very, very well. So whatever is happening in the northern part of the range of Pacific salmon, it's been favorable for all salmon species, but particularly so for pink salmon. The disparity between their abundance and the other species has grown in recent years, so they're doing very, very well. A very unusual and peculiar feature in their native range is that they are essentially all 2 years old at maturity. That is, the juveniles bred in 2017 will mature as adults in 2019, and their offspring will come back in 2021, and so forth. And this creates the situation of having odd and even year lines that are very, very different in abundance. And I believe you're experiencing this over in Europe. And you think, how can the streams be so full of salmon on odd numbered years and essentially devoid of them on even numbered years? The geneticists tell us that there is so little gene flow between odd and even year lines, that the odd and even year lines in a given river are more genetically distinct than are the even year fish in Asia to the even year fish in North America. So there's an extremely high degree of segregation in both population dynamics and gene flow. Oddly, so to speak, the odd year runs predominate at the southern end of the range. So in Puget Sound, we have millions of naturally produced pink salmon returning on odd numbered years, but virtually none on the even numbered years. In the middle of the range in northern British Columbia and southeast Alaska, you have a mix of even and odd year runs. And the northern part of the range in Alaska, the even year runs start to predominate. And why this is and how it came about is a subject of a much different lecture. But the short answer is we don't know. It's a thing that we have to take for granted, but it's a very, very conspicuous thing. And so I gather you're seeing quite different, right, dramatic differences in abundance between odd and even numbered years over in Europe. So again, the review here showing photographs, the alevin, more or less typical alevin with a yolk sac, fry about 30, 32 millimeters in length, would typically be migrating to sea. Might see juveniles in the 30, 40, 50 millimeter range in nearshore waters, but then fairly quickly moving into the offshore waters by the end of their first summer in marine waters, feeding at sea in the epipelagic zone, open ocean, and then come back, coming through coastal waters with this diagram here, and then sexual dimorphism, very, very dramatically different appearance between males and females. And of course, importantly, like all the Pacific salmon, they're semiparous. So they will die with all certainty at the end of their first breeding season. And so you have, in addition to the short lifespan, a highly productive one, because the entire lifetime reproductive success is accomplished with a single round of reproduction. And that means in some cases, very, very large numbers of carcasses because they inevitably die. We have scavengers and predators that take advantage of that, but obviously if people are not used to seeing large numbers of dead salmon, it can be quite disconcerting. So, as I said, there are some peculiarities here. The first is in the southern end of the range in Puget Sound, we have primarily odd year pink salmon, and they spawn fairly early in the fall in rather large rivers. In fact, we would commonly see them spawning at the same place and time as our large-bodied Chinook salmon. Chum salmon, for example, another species which are larger bodied though, would spawn separate in smaller streams later. Now, why the pink salmon here don't use the small streams, it's not clear, but we have many, many streams in Puget Sound that are completely suitable in terms of gravel size and temperature and gradient and so forth for pink salmon that they don't use. In the middle of the range, pink and chum are typically spawning at the same time in the same place. In the lower reaches of small streams, in fact, little trickles will have pink salmon, and both species will actually spawn in the intertidal zone. And yes, I did say intertidal zone. Then toward the northern end of the range, the two species tend to diverge. You find pinks using larger rivers again, and it's not entirely clear what's going on here. So just to give you an illustration of some of these, I've got a few photographs to put this in context. So here in Puget Sound, we have the Skagit River shown in the upper left, and the Sauk River in the lower two photographs. You can see these large gravel bars. This is a substantial river, and we would have pink salmon spawning in the margins of this fairly good-sized river in September and early October, along with Chinook or king salmon. In the middle of the range, we might see them spawning in places like this Salani Creek on Kodiak Island. It's a small stream, and those are bears, brown bears that are feeding on them. If you turned around and you looked, rather than looking upstream towards that mountain, standing on the bridge, and you look downstream, you'd see that this is actually a stream flowing right into saltwater. Here, the intertidal zone is used for spawning by pink salmon. And so very, very low reaches of this very small river, completely different habitat from where we would see them here in Puget Sound. And then in the northern end of the range, this is the Agulawak River. It's a substantial river draining a series of lakes into Lake Aleknagik. And you might have on the order of 100,000 pink salmon spawning in that river. So just when you think you know what kind of habitat they use, they may be using some different habitat. And of course, these are genetically adapted populations that use these different habitats, but it's wise to bear in mind that generalities are risky in the case of pink salmon, despite their deceptively simple life history. So the next question, and I think it's probably the pressing one for you folks, is what have we learned about pink salmon in North America that might be informative to you as you experience, manage around, deal with, address the large numbers of pink salmon that are showing up? And of course, to some people, this is a bonanza, and to others, it's a crisis. That's a more complicated question that I'll let you tackle, but I'll just share with you some of the experiences that we've had in the West Coast. In order, there'll be the post-glacial recolonization of Alaska, removal of barriers and recolonization in British Columbia, our recent experience in Puget Sound, failures of transplants, and then the story in our Laurentian Great Lakes. So we often talk about the last ice age as though it was thousands of years ago. But of course, in Alaska, the ice age and the ice age retreat is happening right now. I ask you to look at these two photographs, one taken in 1941 and another in 2004 from the same vantage point by the US Geological Survey. This is Glacier Bay. And when the first explorers move up the coast, I'm talking about European explorers, of course, not the native people, Captain Cook and Vancouver and so forth, it was all glacier and no bay. 100 years later, it was part bay and part glacier, and the glaciers are receding so fast that in decades, 50 years or so, numerous new streams are being created and colonized by biota, including Pacific salmon. So I ask you to look at this photograph, and you'll see there the water, the mountains, and ice. And of course, that's probably tens of meters high. Look at the ice, and in your mind's eye, make it disappear. Look at the ice right here and make it disappear, and think about what you are going to have underneath. What you would have, what we are seeing, is something like this. This is my former graduate student, Scott Gendy, is a scientist with the National Park Service. This is Wolf Point Creek. Mere decades ago, this was glaciated. The ice melted. The river started to cut a channel through the rocks and gravel. Alder was able to establish itself, fix nitrogen, leaf litter, insects colonized, and fishes, including, among other things, but not exclusively, pink salmon. Scientists have been studying this, not myself, but others, including a man named Sandy Milner. And this particular stream, Wolf Point Creek, was surveyed regularly for the appearance of Pacific salmon. And here are the data that he reported. For about 10 years, absolutely no fish, no pink salmon at all. These are 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 counts. And then look, 100, 1,250, 3,600, 7,200, and then it seemed to reach carrying capacity about 10,000. So very, very rapid colonization and establishment. And of course, this would have happened over and over again, all up and down the coast of Asia and North America, multiple times, because the Pacific salmon species are millions of years old. So the extirpation and recolonization is an important and fundamental aspect of the basic biology of our salmon, and of course, yours too over in Europe. Another example, this one not a natural recolonization, but an assisted one, occurred in the Fraser River, which is a very large basin in British Columbia, in a place called Hell's Gate. And you know, if there's a place called Hell's Gate, it's probably a tough spot. There are no dams on the main stem of the Fraser River, and it goes about 1,000 kilometers up here to the Stewart Lake system. So this is in a canyon of the Fraser River in a lower part of the section. But most of the spawning habitat, which I'm showing you with my pointer here, is upstream of Hell's Gate. And here's what it looked like in the late 1800s. Obviously a very, very difficult place for fish to pass. Hard to believe, but the water's over 30 meters deep here. So you're constricting a huge basin through this narrow slot, but large populations of salmon, including pink salmon, were able to make it past that. 1913, rocks dumped from railroad construction greatly constricted it. And then another rock slide occurred associated with the railroad tracks. And the water was so swift and the vertical drop so great that upriver runs of pink salmon were completely blocked, and all of the upriver runs were completely eliminated. And again, this is what it looked like in 1914 after the collapse of the rock cliff. You can see that the water was simply too swift, even for the most athletic pink salmon to get up there. Velocities of 5 to 7 meters a second. Eventually, after the Second World War, the United States and Canada got together and built a series of sophisticated fishways. And this is a view of the fishways. These are so-called vertical slot fishways where the salmon can access at many different river heights through these orifices and swim up there depending on the height of the river and emerge past the very, very swift water. Records were reported by Fred Whistler. Up to the time of the Second World War, the runs of pink salmon in the upper river were 0. And then look at the rate of increase. This is, of course, on a log scale here. So approximately 10-fold every 2 generations and 100-fold increase in 4 generations till they reached a carrying capacity. So when habitat is suitable, pink salmon have an astonishing capacity to colonize and take advantage of opportunities. Here in Puget Sound, there was a river called the White River, tributary of the Puyallup. The runs there had been 0, yes, 0, because there was a fish trap. These are quite accurate counts. Then starting in the early 2000s, look at the rate of increase here. And these were some of the runs. Again, only on odd numbered years, however, not a 1 on even numbered years. 13,000, 33,000, 127,000. And before you know it, you're carrying capacity of about 500,000 naturally spawned pink salmon. So amazing capacity for populations to grow and colonize suitable habitat. However, the fact that Puget Sound is heavily populated by odd year pink salmon, but not even year populations, did not go unnoticed. For many, many years, they tried to transplant even year runs from British Columbia and Alaska. They never established a single even year run of pink salmon in Puget Sound, despite many, many efforts and millions of fry that were introduced. Tried it again more recently after raising fish in saltwater pens, tried it in British Columbia. It appears in the native range of pink salmon, transplants, and there have been many, have not established a single new run of the species. So it is as though they have colonized all the suitable habitat unless a barrier is removed, and the absence of pink salmon is due to something fundamental, even though we don't understand it. And we have hundreds of millions of pink salmon on odd numbered years and virtually none on even numbered years here in Puget Sound. Most puzzling. The final bit of our experience I'll share with you comes in the Laurentian Great Lakes. The plan in the 1950s was for Canadians to introduce pink salmon to tributaries of Hudson Bay to provide subsistence and food fish for the local people. The short version is that they planted them and never found a single one surviving. So the transplant that was deliberate to tributaries of Hudson Bay was completely unsuccessful. No adults were ever found in that stream. However, 3 years later, not a year later as they expected, but 3 years later, pink salmon were caught in Lake Superior. And it later came out that the hatchery manager didn't take the time to make another run to Hudson Bay with the remaining couple of thousand fry and basically flush them down the drain. The drain led to the Current River, which led to Lake Superior. Those handful of fry, remember what they've been talking in the previous transplants were hundreds of thousands or millions. Now we're talking in the thousands of fry, made it down to Lake Superior, spawned under the radar screen. Their offspring came back and spawned. And within a few decades, they colonized all 5 of these enormous lakes. Most curiously, they're now starting to spawn at other than 2 years of age. And so some 1, 3, and even age 4 fish have been reported, even though in the native range, such fish are essentially non-existent. So again, these are enormous bodies of water. The fry were established here by accident, 59, 69, 73, and in roughly 20 years, they colonized all of the Great Lakes. So what do we make of all of this? Pink salmon life cycle is simple. In the native range, 2 years old at maturity, although don't count on that staying forever in Europe. They leave the natal stream at once, so the impact on the freshwater food web as juveniles is negligible. Populations are very volatile because all of their mortality occurs in the gravel and out at sea. The vagaries of ocean survival and flooding in freshwater cause the populations to go up and down, highly volatile, but have extraordinary capacity for population growth if things are working well for them. Efforts to establish new populations in the native range have essentially never succeeded. And yet we have strange cases like the Great Lakes and what's happening over in Europe. So I'll leave you with one of my throwaway remarks I give to my students about pink salmon and everything else. Hypotheses come and go. The fish are always right. They do what they do, and it is our challenge to interpret, to understand, and to plan, but we will be fooled by them and proven wrong time and again. Again, I wish I were with you in person. I would greatly enjoy handling questions and talking about this. For now, though, I'll just say thanks for your time and attention and leave you with one more beautiful picture by my friend John McMillan of male and female pink salmon and a little steelhead trout here in Puget Sound. Thanks very much.